After 7 haunting years of desperate searching, Catherine Wilson finally found her daughter in Amsterdam's infamous red light district, only to discover that the young woman she knew as Claire had become Tracy, a woman deeply scarred by years of exploitation and addiction. Though Catherine yearned to rebuild their shattered lives and return to normalcy in Orlando, she soon realized that the trauma her daughter had endured had transformed her into someone unrecognizable, with ties to this dark world that couldn't be easily severed. As authorities began unraveling the complex web of the trafficking operation, they uncovered the full extent of the horrors Tracy had endured all these years, testing the bonds between mother and daughter in ways neither could have imagined. Before we dive into part 2 of this gripping story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of the Amsterdam safe house, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floor. Catherine Wilson lay wide awake on her bed, having barely slept since the night before. The sound of traffic from the road outside signaled that the day had started in earnest, but Catherine felt disconnected from the world beyond these walls. With a weary sigh, she pushed herself up and moved over the side of the bed. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by exhaustion and worry. She made her way to the small adjoining bathroom, splashing cold water on her face in an attempt to wash away some of the fatigue that clung to her like a shroud. As she patted her skin dry with a soft towel, the shrill ring of the doorbell pierced the quiet of the house. Catherine froze for a moment, her heart rate quickening. Even after several days in this safe house, she still felt on edge, as if danger lurked around every corner. She stepped out of the bathroom, just as Tracy emerged from her own room. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she looked at her daughter. Tracy looked better than she had in days, the haunted look in her eyes slightly diminished. It was moments like these when Catherine could almost see glimpses of the Claire she had lost so long ago. "Don't worry, I'll get it," Catherine said softly, her voice still rough from lack of sleep. Tracy nodded and padded towards the kitchen as Catherine made her way to the front door. She took a deep breath, steeling herself before opening it. On the other side stood Officer Matthias de Vries, his Interpol uniform crisp and official. Beside him were 2 medical workers, their expressions neutral and professional. Catherine felt a mix of relief and anxiety at the sight of them. This had become their morning routine, but it never got easier. "Good morning, Catherine," Officer Matthias greeted her with a gentle smile. "Did you manage to get some rest last night?" Catherine forced a smile, not wanting to worry him with the truth of her ongoing insomnia. "Better than before, officer. Thank you for asking." She stepped aside to let them enter, already familiar with the routine that had been established over the past few days. As the medical team began setting up their equipment in the living room, Catherine watched Tracy settle onto the sofa beside one of the workers. Officer Matthias stood nearby, his presence reassuring in its constancy. "From the medical reports I've received, Tracy is doing well," he told Catherine in a low voice, his eyes kind but serious. "Depending on her results today and tomorrow, she could get medical clearance to return to the US in the next 3 days. You could continue the rest of her rehabilitation and therapy there." Hope blossomed in Catherine's chest, a feeling so foreign after years of disappointment that it almost hurt. "We could fly back in 3 days?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. Matthias nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "The US Embassy is aware of the situation. They've arranged an emergency passport for Tracy, and the FBI will handle the flight arrangements once they receive the clearance." Catherine's gaze drifted to Tracy, who was being assessed by the medical worker. She noted how her daughter seemed calmer, admitting to fewer severe withdrawal symptoms in her daily life. As the medical team prepared the injection, explaining that today's dose would be lower than yesterday's, Catherine felt the familiar sense of dread creeping up her spine. "Once injected, the medication will trigger withdrawal symptoms instead of a high," the doctor explained, his voice calm and clinical. "Be prepared." Tracy nodded, her eyes meeting Catherine's across the room. Catherine had always been on edge during these treatments, having witnessed the severe tremors, paranoia, and vomiting Tracy had experienced in the beginning, but yesterday had been better, and today's lower dosage gave her a glimmer of hope. As the medical team administered the injection, Catherine held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. At first, Tracy seemed fine, her expression neutral as she sat quietly on the sofa. However, within 10 minutes, Catherine noticed a shift. Tracy's breathing quickened, her fingers fidgeting restlessly in her lap. She shifted on the sofa, unable to find a comfortable position. "Is she going to be all right?" Catherine asked the doctor, anxiety creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to remain calm. The doctor nodded reassuringly, his eyes kind behind his glasses. "We're confident she will be. This might be hard to watch, but we've seen worse and gotten through it. Tracy is making excellent progress." Catherine watched as Tracy's symptoms gradually intensified, though not as severely as that first terrible day. The medical workers instructed Catherine to keep a close eye on Tracy, to make sure she rested and drank plenty of fluids. After Catherine signed some papers, they departed, leaving her alone with her daughter and the lingering effects of the treatment. Catherine watched anxiously as Tracy's symptoms gradually manifested, though not as dramatically as on that first dreadful day. A thin sheen of sweat formed on Tracy's forehead, her breaths coming faster, shallower. She pressed a trembling hand to her temple, wincing as if the light itself hurt. The lead medical worker handed Catherine a list of forms and instructions. "Keep her hydrated, make sure she rests. If her condition changes, fever spikes, breathing worsens, call us immediately." Her voice was calm but firm, the weight of responsibility settling onto Catherine's shoulders. Catherine nodded, gripping the papers as she observed them collecting their medical supplies. She took the pen and signed the paperwork, then handed back the copy, her movements precise and measured. On the sofa, Tracy stirred weakly, her fingers twitching repeatedly, opening and closing as if grasping for stability. With a few final words of reassurance, Officer Matthias offered a small, steady nod. "Take care, and we'll keep you updated on the return arrangements," he said, his tone gentle. His team turned toward the door, their boots making soft, measured sounds against the floor as they exited, the door clicking shut behind them. The silence that followed felt oddly heavy. Catherine stood still for a moment, staring at the closed door before exhaling and turning back to Tracy, who lay motionless on the sofa, her breathing slow but steady. Catherine settled onto the sofa next to Tracy, her heart aching at the sight of her daughter's distress. Tracy's skin was pale, a thin sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the sofa cushion. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Catherine asked gently, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Tracy's face. Instead of answering, Tracy turned to Catherine with pain-filled eyes. Her lower lip quivered as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you want me back?" "Look at me. There's nothing good about me," she asked, the words laced with a desperation that broke Catherine's heart. "Or do you just feel obligated to help me?" Catherine sighed, recognizing the withdrawal symptoms at work. She had been warned about this. The sudden paranoias and mood swings, the self-doubt, the echoes of the manipulation Tracy had endured for so long. "Oh, Tracy," she murmured, taking her daughter's trembling hands in her own. "You're safe now. You're here with me, and I accept you as you are. We'll get through this together." Tracy's eyes welled with tears. "I'm worthless," she whispered, her voice cracking, just like Victor always said. The mention of that name sent a surge of anger through Catherine, but she pushed it down, focusing on comforting her daughter. "Officer Matthias says you're doing better," she said, her voice steady and warm. "We could be back in the US soon, maybe even in 3 days. Once you get your medical clearance, all this will be over. I'll make sure you have all the support you need to heal from this." Tracy seemed to calm a bit at Catherine's words, though anxiety still lined her face, and her hands continued to shake. Catherine helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way to Tracy's bedroom. "Let's get you comfortable," she said softly. "I'll make you some tea to help ease the anxiety." As Tracy settled onto her bed, Catherine went to the kitchen to prepare the tea. Her mind raced as she waited for the water to boil, thinking of all they had been through and all that still lay ahead. When she returned to Tracy's room with the steaming mug, she found her daughter sitting up against the headboard, her knees drawn up to her chest. Tracy took a few sips of the tea, her hands steadier now as she held the mug. "This is so hard," she admitted, her eyes meeting Catherine's. "I'm scared that even after all this treatment and effort, I'll slip and fall back into the addiction again. Then all this will be for nothing." Catherine hesitated, then asked gently, "Would you like it if I started to refer to you as Claire? I've read that some people are able to overcome their past by reclaiming their real identity." But Tracy shook her head, her expression pained. "Not yet," she said softly. "I want to deserve that name first." Catherine nodded, understanding. "I'll make sure you recover fully," she promised. "Once we're back in the US and far from this country, it'll get easier. You can start a new life." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the occasional sip of tea or rustle of bedsheets, as Tracy shifted position. Eventually, exhaustion began to overtake her, her eyelids growing heavy. "Why don't you try to get some sleep?" Catherine suggested, taking the half-empty mug from Tracy's hands. Tracy nodded, sliding down in the bed until her head rested on the pillow. Catherine pulled the blanket up over her, tucking it around her shoulders, just as she had done when Tracy was a little girl. The familiar gesture brought a lump to her throat. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," Catherine said softly, moving towards the door. "Mum?" Tracy's voice stopped her. "Thank you for everything." Catherine smiled, her heart swelling with love. "Always, sweetheart, always." As Tracy drifted off to sleep, Catherine stood in the doorway, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with each breath. Memories of doing the same when Claire was young flooded back, bitter-sweet in their intensity. The sight of Tracy sleeping peacefully calmed her, and she felt her own exhaustion creeping in. As Catherine left Tracy's room, she decided to try for a nap herself. She left her bedroom door ajar, ensuring she could hear the doorbell, or if Tracy woke up. Before lying down, she checked her phone and saw a message from Sophia Van Dyke, the woman who had helped her find Tracy after 7 years of searching. Sophia mentioned she planned to stop by around 4 p.m. with some food. Catherine typed a quick reply, thanking Sophia for her kindness and confirming that 4 p.m. would be fine. Then she settled onto her bed, the events of the morning replaying in her mind. As she closed her eyes, she allowed herself a moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to look up. With that thought, she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Catherine jolted awake, disoriented and groggy. The room was bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon sunlight, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then she saw Sophia standing in her doorway, and reality came rushing back. "Sophia," Catherine mumbled, pushing herself up to a sitting position. "What time is it?" Sophia smiled apologetically. "It's 4:30 p.m. I'm sorry to wake you, but I was worried when no one answered the door." Catherine's eyes widened in shock as she glanced at the clock on her bedside table. She had slept for hours, far longer than she had intended. "Oh my God," she gasped, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "I can't believe I slept so long." She broke off as she noticed Officer Matthias appearing behind Sophia, his expression grave. The sight of him in his Interpol uniform sent a chill down Catherine's spine. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden fear. "Is Tracy okay?" Officer Matthias stepped into the room, his posture tense. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, his tone carefully controlled, "I need you to stay calm, but we have a situation. We can't find Tracy." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She stood up quickly, her head spinning from the sudden movement and the shock of the news. "What do you mean you can't find her?" she asked, her voice rising. "She was sleeping in her room the last time I saw her." She pushed past Sophia and Matthias, rushing across the hall to Tracy's room. The bed was empty, the covers thrown back haphazardly. Catherine's heart raced as she turned back to the others. "Have you searched everywhere? When did this happen?" Officer Matthias explained that they had searched the entire house, but found no sign of Tracy. Sophia added that she had called the officer as soon as she realized Tracy was missing when she arrived at 4 p.m. Catherine's mind raced, trying to piece together what might have happened. "The red light district," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Have you searched there?" Maybe she went back. The police assured her that teams were already searching the area, but Catherine couldn't shake the guilt that washed over her. She should have seen this coming and shouldn't have allowed herself to sleep, knowing how the withdrawal symptoms could lead to such a situation. Her mind spiraled into the worst-case scenario, wondering if Tracy had relapsed and was searching for substances again, or worse, if she had gone to meet someone she shouldn't. Grabbing her phone from the bedside table, Catherine searched frantically for any messages from Tracy, but found none. "Can we trace her phone? It's the one you gave her, officer," she asked, her voice trembling with desperation as she looked to Officer Matthias. "She left her phone in her room," he replied, his expression sympathetic but professional. "We've already secured it." Catherine sank onto the edge of her bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her. She couldn't lose Tracy again, not after everything they had been through. Sophia sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "The police will find her," she said softly. "She won't have gone far." Just as Catherine was about to respond, there was a commotion at the front door. She jumped to her feet, hope and fear warring in her chest as she rushed out of the room. In the living room, she saw an Amsterdam officer talking to Tracy, who had just returned. Relief flooded through Catherine as she quickly approached her daughter. Tracy looked to be in a better mood than she had been that morning, but there was something off about her expression that Catherine couldn't quite place. "Where did you go?" Catherine asked, reaching out to hold Tracy's hand. "Everyone's been so worried. The police have been looking for you." Tracy looked apologetic, but her eyes not quite meeting Catherine's. "I didn't expect everyone to literally be looking for me," she said, her voice slightly slurred. "I just went for a walk along the canal to get some fresh air. I've been cooped up in the house for 3 days and it felt too constricting. I saw you were sleeping and I didn't want to disturb you." Officer Matthias stepped forward, his tone sympathetic but firm. "What you did was dangerous, Tracy," he said. "There's a reason we put you and your mother in the safe house under surveillance. It's not to restrict you, but to protect you. We haven't found the leader, Lotte Sokolov, and his connections yet. Amsterdam is a small area, and if you wandered alone, there's a chance any one of them could have seen you." Tracy apologized again, her gaze dropping to the floor. Officer Matthias's expression softened slightly. "I know it's not easy to just stay inside, especially with the treatment," he said, "but it's only for a few more days." Turning to Catherine, he added, "The blood work results from this morning's sample were good. Tracy is on track to recovery. You just have to endure this for a little while longer." Catherine nodded, a mix of relief and lingering worry warring within her. She studied Tracy's face, noticing the faint emptiness and regret in her eyes, the way she kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself, swaying almost imperceptibly on her feet. As if sensing her thoughts, Officer Matthias's expression shifted to one of seriousness. "Actually," he began, "the investigation team has requested that we get Tracy's testimony and have her show us on site what happened to her during all this time. This will help gather stronger evidence, both visual and factual, so we can ensure Viktor Sokolov is put behind bars with the highest charges possible. No chance of him getting probation from the judge." Catherine looked uncertain, her protective instincts flaring. But before she could respond, Tracy spoke up. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I think I'm ready." Surprised, Catherine turned to her daughter. "Are you sure? We could do it tomorrow if you're not feeling up to it now." But Tracy shook her head. "Perhaps we can do it this evening," she suggested, an eagerness in her voice that Catherine found unsettling. "I prefer that than staying inside." "But it's 5:30 p.m. now," Catherine protested. "It'll be getting dark in an hour." Officer Matthias nodded thoughtfully. "For this one I can make an exception. We can squeeze in the time," he said. "After all, the brothel has been closed down and secured by police, and the red light district is still relatively quiet at this hour. Tomorrow morning Tracy will have another treatment session, and she might not have the strength. So while she's up for it, We should do it. Catherine hesitated, torn between her desire to protect Tracy and the need to move forward with the case. She considered perhaps this could be good for Tracy. By giving her testimony and becoming more involved in the case, it might help her strengthen her new identity, showing her that she is no longer powerless. Finally, she nodded her agreement, praying she wasn't making a mistake. As they prepared to leave, Catherine turned to Sophia, gratitude welling up inside her. "Thank you for coming all this way with food," she said. "I'm sorry we couldn't spend time together." Sophia smiled warmly. "Don't worry about it. I'll put the food in the fridge, and maybe tonight after this we could stay home and have dinner together." Catherine nodded, grateful for Sophia's understanding and support. As Officer Matthias announced it was time to go, Sophia said she'd follow in her own vehicle. With a deep breath, Catherine followed Tracy and Officer Matthias to the police car. As they drove away, the Amsterdam sky softly lit by the setting sun. The drive to the red light district was quiet, the only sound breaking the stillness being the occasional crackle of the police radio. Catherine sat in the back with Tracy, watching her daughter's profile as she stared out the window. Tracy's expression was unreadable, her eyes distant, as if her mind were already somewhere far away. In less than 20 minutes they arrived at their destination. 3 police cars parked by the street, and Catherine felt a twinge of nervousness as she remembered what had happened that night when she had passed through this area with Sophia. The neon lights were just beginning to flicker on, casting an eerie glow over the narrow streets. They exited the police car, the cool evening air carrying the faint sounds of music from nearby clubs. Officer Matthias led them to the crime scene, the Velvet Room. Catherine's stomach churned as she read the garish sign, knowing what had happened to her daughter behind those walls. Matthias unlocked the door of the closed-down brothel, and they entered. 2 officers were stationed outside to watch, their presence both reassuring and a stark reminder of the danger that still lurked. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the lingering scent of perfume and cigarette smoke. Matthias and 3 other officers, one carrying a camera, began to record the place while Tracy gave her statements. Catherine hung back, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she tried to reconcile the gaudy interior with the horrors her daughter had endured here. At first, Tracy seemed composed as she walked them through the layout of the brothel, her voice steady as she described the daily routines and the customers who frequented the place. But as they entered the rooms with the beds by the display window, where Catherine had seen Tracy that fateful night, the atmosphere changed. Tracy walked to the bed and demonstrated how she used to do her job, sitting in the same position and posing at the window so that passers-by could see her. Her movements were mechanical, her eyes glazed over as if she were trapped in a haunting memory. Catherine's heart broke again, the weight of what Tracy had endured settling on her. Yet a flicker of thought crossed her mind. How could Tracy perform this so effortlessly, recounting and reliving her daily routine to the police without hesitation? Catherine told herself it was something she would never fully understand, not being in her daughter's shoes. 7 years of working for men, of surviving in that world, had left a mark too deep to fully comprehend. As Tracy continued to give the officers details about what she used to do in the room, Catherine found it too hard to bear. The clinical way Tracy described the abuse she had endured, the customers she had been forced to service, it was all too much. With a choked apology, Catherine excused herself and walked out of the room, needing to escape the suffocating weight of her daughter's past. Outside, the cool air struck her like a slap, and she inhaled it deeply, grateful for the sharpness that grounded her. She leaned against the wall of the building, closing her eyes as she tried to steady her breathing. This was for the best, she reminded herself. This testimony would help put Victor away for good. It would help Tracy heal. But Catherine couldn't deny that a small part of her wished these days would pass quickly, that they could return home to Orlando, where she could give Tracy the fresh start she so desperately needed, where they could begin anew, and she could offer her daughter the best rehab possible. "Catherine?" Sophia's gentle voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you okay?" Catherine opened her eyes to see Sophia approaching, concern etched on her face. "I just couldn't breathe in there," Catherine admitted, her voice shaky. Sophia nodded understanding, moving to stand beside her. "It's a lot to take in," she said softly. "You're being so strong for her." As they waited for the group to finish inside, Catherine found herself scanning the area. The street was still relatively quiet, with only a few people passing by. The music from nearby clubs was muted, the alleys mostly empty. It was the calm before the storm of the district's nightly activities. Suddenly, Catherine's eyes locked onto a man entering the bar across the narrow alley street. He took a seat overlooking the brothel, his gaze sweeping the area before settling on the building where Tracy was giving her testimony. There was something about him that made Catherine uneasy. "Sophia," she said quietly, nodding towards the man. "Do you see him? The one who just sat down in that bar?" Sophia followed her gaze, studying the man for a moment. "Yes, I see him. What about him?" "I don't know," Catherine said, frowning. "There's just something off. The way he keeps looking at the velvet room. It's like he knows something." Sophia watched the man for a moment longer. "Perhaps he's just curious about the police presence," she suggested. "He seems like an ordinary man." Catherine nodded, trying to shake off her unease. "Maybe you're right," she said, though she couldn't quite convince herself. Just then the door to the brothel opened, and Tracy emerged with the police officers. Catherine straightened up, her eyes immediately going to her daughter's face. Tracy looked pale and drawn now. The ordeal of reliving her experiences must be taking its toll. As Catherine moved to go to her, she noticed Tracy's gaze shift to the bar across the street. For a brief moment, Tracy's eyes locked with the man Catherine had been watching. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Catherine caught it. "Tracy," she said softly, reaching out to touch her daughter's arm. "Do you know that man?" Tracy's eyes snapped back to Catherine, a flicker of something, fear, guilt, passing across her face before it was replaced by a neutral expression. "What man?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Catherine frowned, concern growing in the pit of her stomach. She gently guided Tracy a few steps away from the others, lowering her voice. "The man in the bar across the street. I saw you look at him. Do you know him? If you do, you have to tell the officers." Tracy shook her head, but Catherine could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted back towards the bar for a split second. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mom," she said, a slight edge to her voice. As Catherine opened her mouth to press further, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There on Tracy's right arm was a small, fresh mark, a needle puncture that hadn't been there this morning. "Tracy," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's this?" She gently touched the mark on Tracy's arm. Tracy jerked away, her eyes wide with panic. "It's nothing, don't touch it," she said quickly. "Just from the treatment this morning." But Catherine knew better. The medical team always injected Tracy in her left arm, not her right. A sick feeling settled in her stomach as the pieces began to fall into place. Tracy's disappearance, her improved mood upon return, the slight glassiness in her eyes that Catherine had attributed to exhaustion. Before she could confront Tracy about her suspicions, Officer Matthias approached them. "We're done here," he said, his tone professional but kind. "You've both been very helpful. Let's get you back to the safe house." As they made their way back to the police cars, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that Tracy was hiding something from her. She watched her climb into the back seat, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the way she avoided meeting anyone's eyes. The drive back to the safe house was silent, the air thick with unspoken questions and growing tension. Catherine's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. Should she confront Tracy? Tell Officer Matthias about her suspicions? Or was she jumping to conclusions, seeing problems where there were none because of her own fears and anxieties? As they pulled up to the safe house, Catherine made a decision. She would talk to Tracy tonight after dinner with Sophia. They would get to the bottom of this together, mother and daughter, just as they had promised to do from the beginning. The evening passed in a blur of tension and forced normalcy. Sophia had prepared a simple but delicious meal, and the three women sat around the small dining table, the air heavy with unspoken words. Tracy picked at her food, her eyes darting occasionally to the clock on the wall. Catherine watched her daughter closely, noting every nervous gesture, every fleeting expression that crossed her face. Sophia, sensing the tension, tried to keep the conversation light. talking about her experiences in Amsterdam and her time in Orlando. As the meal drew to a close, Tracy abruptly stood up. "I'm really tired," she announced, her voice slightly strained. "I think I'm going to turn in early." Catherine opened her mouth to protest, to insist that they needed to talk, but something in Tracy's eyes stopped her. Instead, she nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course, sweetheart, get some rest." Tracy disappeared into her room, the soft click of the door closing echoing in the sudden silence. Sophia began clearing the dishes, shooting concerned glances at Catherine. "Is everything okay?" Sophia asked softly, as they stood side by side at the sink, rinsing plates. Catherine sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I don't know," she admitted. "Something's not right with Tracy, but I can't put my finger on it." Sophia placed a comforting hand on Catherine's arm. "You've both been through so much, it's bound to be a difficult adjustment." Catherine nodded, but the knot of worry in her stomach only tightened. As Sophia prepared to leave, Catherine walked her to the door, thanking her again for her kindness and support. "Call me if you need anything," Sophia insisted, as she stepped out into the cool evening air. "Anything at all." Once Sophia had left, Catherine locked the front door, carefully placing the key in her purse inside her room, a precaution she took after the earlier incident, when Tracy had fled the house. She paused outside Tracy's door, straining to hear any sound of movement, but all was silent. Exhausted both physically and emotionally, Catherine changed into her sleepwear and climbed into bed. She left the bedside lamp on, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in her mind. The man at the bar, the fresh needle mark on Tracy's arm, her daughter's unsettling behavior, it all swirled in her thoughts, a heavy weight that wouldn't let go. Once again, Catherine found herself wishing that Tracy would soon get the medical clearance so they could return home to Orlando, where they could try to rebuild their lives far from the ghost of the past. Sleep eluded her, the silence of the safe house broken only by the occasional sound of traffic from the street below. Catherine wasn't sure how much time had passed when she heard it. The soft creak of a floorboard, so faint she almost thought she'd imagined it. She held her breath, listening intently. There it was again, the whisper of movement outside her door. Slowly, carefully, Catherine turned onto her side, facing the door but keeping her eyes nearly closed, feigning sleep. The door opened a crack, a sliver of darkness appearing in the warm glow of the bedside lamp. Catherine's heart raced, but she forced her breathing to remain slow and steady. She could make out a silhouette in the doorway, hesitating for a moment before slipping into the room. The footsteps were almost silent. Catherine fought the urge to open her eyes to confront the intruder she knew must be Tracy. Instead, she waited, every muscle tense, as she heard the soft rustle of someone going through her purse. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. The door closed with a gentle click, and Catherine was alone once more. She waited a few more minutes, her mind racing, before she sat up and reached for her purse. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, already knowing what she would find. The key to the front door was gone, and as she checked her wallet, she discovered that a few €100 were missing as well. Grief and anger warred within her as Catherine got out of bed and quickly dressed. She had to find Tracy before it was too late, before she did something she couldn't take back. Catherine's heart pounded as she opened her bedroom door and stepped into the darkened hallway. She moved quietly to Tracy's room, hoping against hope that her daughter was still in the house. But when she pushed open the door, the room was empty. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the bed, a stark reminder of her daughter's absence. Her eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for any clue, any hint of where Tracy might have gone. It was then that she noticed the small piece of paper on the nightstand. With trembling hands, Catherine picked it up, instantly recognizing Tracy's handwriting. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she forced herself to focus. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know I don't deserve this life. I'm not your little Claire anymore. I couldn't come back with you before I finish this." She clutched the note to her chest, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. What did Tracy mean by finish this? What was she planning to do? Just then, a distant roar of a motorbike echoed through the quiet street. Catherine rushed to the window, catching only a fleeting glimpse of a tail light disappearing into the night. Her heart pounded. That must be Tracy. Where was she going? And more importantly, who was she with? Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Catherine knew she couldn't waste time breaking down. She had to act, and quickly. She rushed to the front door, her bare feet silent on the cool hardwood floor. The key was already hanging in the lock, a silent testament to Tracy's departure. Catherine stepped out into the night, the cool Amsterdam air brushing against her skin. She glanced around, convinced that Tracy couldn't have gone far. But the street was unnervingly quiet, disturbed only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of a streetlight. Her gaze swept over the empty sidewalks, searching desperately for any sign of her daughter's retreating figure. Yet the streets remained deserted, providing no hint of where Tracy had disappeared. With shaking fingers, Catherine pulled out her phone. The screen's bright light momentarily blinded her in the darkness as she dialed Officer Matthias's number. She winced at how late it was, but this couldn't wait. Each ring seemed to last an eternity before Matthias finally answered, his voice groggy with sleep. "Officer Matthias?" Catherine's voice cracked as she spoke, her grip tightening around the phone. "I'm so sorry to call at this hour, but it's an emergency. Tracy is missing again. She left a note in her room, took the key from my bag and some cash." She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "I don't know where she's gone, but I heard a motorbike outside just moments ago. She left with a man." Her breath hitched as fear clawed at her chest. "Please, you have to help me find her before it's too late." As she listened to Matthias's response, Catherine's eyes continued to search the street, as if Tracy and the motorbike might suddenly appear. The officer's voice became clearer, more alert as he processed the information. "Stay where you are, Mrs. Wilson," he instructed firmly. "I'll send some units to search the area immediately. We'll focus on the canal and the red light district." As the call ended, Catherine felt utterly helpless. The urge to run down the street calling Tracy's name was almost overwhelming. But she knew it would be futile, possibly even dangerous. Her mind raced, trying to think where Tracy might have gone. Suddenly she remembered the man from the bar earlier that evening, the one who had been watching the Velvet Room. Could Tracy have gone to meet him? The thought sent a chill down Catherine's spine. She couldn't just stand here and wait. Without allowing herself to overthink it, she called Sophia. As the phone rang, Catherine paced back and forth on the sidewalk, her free arm wrapped tightly around herself against the night chill. "Sophia?" Catherine's voice was thick with unshed tears when her friend answered. "I'm so sorry to bother you this late, but Tracy is missing again. I can't just sit here and wait for the police to find her. I need your help." Sophia's response was immediate and reassuring, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. "I'm on my way, Catherine. Don't go anywhere alone. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like hours as Catherine waited, her eyes constantly scanning the street, her ears straining for any sound that might indicate Tracy's return. When Sophia's car finally pulled up, Catherine almost sobbed with relief. She climbed into the passenger seat, quickly explaining what had happened as Sophia pulled away from the curb. The warm interior of the car was a stark contrast to the cool night air, but it did little to calm Catherine's frayed nerves. "Let's look around this neighborhood first," Sophia suggested, her eyes scanning the streets as she drove. "We won't go too far." They drove in tense silence, both women's eyes scanning the dimly lit sidewalks and shadowed alleys for any trace of Tracy. The streets were eerily quiet at this hour, save for the occasional late-night reveler stumbling home or a weary shift worker trudging through the night. Every distant rumble of a motorbike sent Catherine's pulse racing, only for disappointment to settle in when it wasn't the one she was looking for. The uncertainty gnawed at her, tightening around her chest like a vice. Where had she gone, and who had she gone with? After about 10 minutes of fruitless searching, the desperation in Catherine's voice was palpable. "Is there any bar or meeting spot around here?" she asked, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. Sophia nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There's a bar a few blocks from here. We can try there." As they approached the bar, Catherine's breath caught in her throat. There, just outside a nearby gas station, she saw two figures climbing onto a motorbike. Even in the dim light, she recognized Tracy's silhouette, the curve of her shoulder, the way she held her head. It was a sight that sent a jolt of both relief and fear through Catherine's body. "There," she cried, pointing. "That's her, and I think that's the man from the bar earlier." Sophia slowed the car, keeping a safe distance as the motorbike pulled out onto the street. "Should we follow them?" she asked, glancing at Catherine. Catherine nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Yes, but carefully. We don't want them to notice us." As Sophia carefully tailed the motorbike, Catherine called Officer Matthias again. Her voice was low and urgent as she updated him on the situation, providing their location and the direction they were heading. The officer's instructions were clear. Keep the line open, continue reporting which streets the bike was taking, but maintain a safe distance. The streets of Amsterdam passed by in a blur of neon signs and shadowy alleys. Catherine's eyes never left the motorbike ahead, her heart racing with each turn. She was terrified of losing sight of Tracy, but equally afraid of what they might discover at their destination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was likely only about 20 minutes, the motorbike slowed and pulled up in front of a modest, two-story Dutch-style house near the canal. Catherine's voice trembled as she relayed the address to Officer Matthias, who informed her that he was just 5 minutes away. "Stay in the car and lock the doors," he instructed firmly. "Do not approach the house." Catherine and Sophia watched from the car, the engine idling quietly, as Tracy and the man removed their helmets. In the glow of a nearby streetlight, Catherine saw Tracy exchange a kiss with the man. The sight sent a jolt of shock through her system, a painful reminder of how much her daughter had changed, how much she had been through. Instead of entering the house through the front door, Tracy and the man walked along a grassy path to the back of the house toward the canal, disappearing from view. Catherine reported this to Officer Matthias, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow alert Tracy to their presence. The next few minutes were agonizing. Catherine and Sophia sat in tense silence, straining to hear any sound from the house. The quiet residential street seemed to hold its breath, the only movement the occasional flutter of curtains in a neighboring house. Just as Catherine was about to suggest they get out of the car to see what was happening, a fleet of police cars arrived, their sirens off to maintain the element of surprise. Catherine watched, her heart in her throat as the officers readied their weapons and approached the house. They moved silently towards the back, where Tracy and the man had gone, their movements precise and coordinated. The wait seemed interminable. Catherine's imagination ran wild, conjuring up scenarios ranging from a peaceful resolution to violent confrontation. She found herself holding her breath, her hand clasped tightly in Sophia's, drawing strength from her friend's presence. Suddenly, the sound of commotion erupted from the grassy path once more. Catherine's breath hitched as she spotted the police leading Tracy and the man out, their hands secured behind their backs in cuffs. Instinct took over. She flung the car door open and bolted toward her daughter, barely registering Sophia's voice behind her, calling out for her to be careful. As she got closer, the details became clearer, each one a knife to Catherine's heart. Tracy's eyes were glassy, her movements uncoordinated. It was painfully obvious that she was under the influence of something. The man beside her looked older up close, his face lined with worry and resignation. "Mum." Tracy's voice was slurred as she spotted Catherine approaching. "Why are you here?" The question, so casual and disconnected from the gravity of the situation, nearly broke Catherine. "You tell me," Catherine said, keeping her voice gentle, despite the whirlwind of emotions crashing inside her. "I heard you when you took the key. I know you stole my cash." "Tell me the truth, Tracy. Who is this man? What are you doing here?" Tracy's unfocused gaze flickered between her and the officer, and for a fleeting second, something like guilt passed over her features. Then she giggled, swaying slightly. "What do you mean?" she murmured, throwing her arms out as if presenting the house. "I'm home." The disconnect between Tracy's words and the reality of the situation was jarring. Catherine exchanged a glance with Officer Matthias. both of them recognizing that Tracy was in no fit state to provide any reliable testimony. Before she could say anything else, flashing red and blue lights washed over the scene as the paramedics arrived. They wasted no time, approaching Tracy with calm, practiced movements. "She needs immediate detox," one of them muttered, preparing an IV. They quickly assessed Tracy's condition before guiding her to the waiting ambulance. Catherine watched anxiously as they began to work, administering treatment to flush the drugs from Tracy's system. While Tracy was being tended to, Catherine turned her attention to the man who had been with her daughter. He appeared more lucid than Tracy, his eyes clear and alert despite the late hour and stressful situation. Officer Matthias began questioning him, and Catherine moved closer to listen, though she kept glancing back at the ambulance where Tracy was being treated. "I'm Hans Sokolov," the man said, his voice steady. "I'm a brother of Victor and Lotta." A ripple of surprise went through the gathered officers. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. Another Sokolov brother? How deep did this web of connections go? Hans seemed to sense their shock. He continued, his tone almost pleading. "Believe it or not, we're on the same side, more or less. I care about Tracy, always have. Yes, I sell substances to her and plenty of others, but I'm not like my brothers. Lotta is the real problem, greedy and ruthless. When I asked for Tracy, he refused to let her go. He's the one pulling the strings now, operating from the shadows. Victor was just running the brothel you raided, holding on to Tracy on Lotta's behalf." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces around him before settling on Officer Matthias. "You're looking for Lotta, aren't you? He's hiding somewhere no one will find him, but I know where he is." A sly smile crossed his face. "That information could make for a good bargain, don't you think?" Matthias's expression remained impassive. "Are you part of Lotta's trafficking group?" he asked. Hans shook his head emphatically. "Not for the last 4 years. I have my own place, but it's different. The girls in my brothel work out of their own free will. They come and go as they please, get their fair share." One of the officers spoke up, mentioning the hard substances found in Hans's possession. Hans didn't miss a beat. "That's where I'll make my bargain," he said smoothly, "for the information about Lotta." He glanced toward Tracy near the ambulance, then turned to Catherine, his expression softening. "Don't worry," he said, his voice gentle. "I only gave her a small dose. She was begging me, and I couldn't refuse her." Catherine felt a mixture of disgust and disbelief at his words. How could he claim to love Tracy while feeding her addiction? Officer Matthias cut in, his voice firm. "We'll need to sort this out at the station. Let's go." As the officers led Hans to a police car, Catherine's attention was drawn back to the ambulance. Tracy was sitting up now, looking more alert. The paramedics had explained that because she'd been given a lower dose, her system was flushing the drugs more quickly. Tracy's voice rang out surprisingly clear. "Please don't hurt him," she pleaded with the officers. "Hans is a good person. He's the only one I could trust." Catherine's heart broke at these words. She had never realized how deeply Tracy had been pulled into this world, that she could see someone like Hans as a good person, and even fall in love with him. Suddenly, Tracy's reluctance to reclaim her identity as Claire made more sense, as did her doubts about ever truly returning to US. Approaching the ambulance with Officer Matthias, Catherine listened as the paramedic confirmed Tracy's stable condition and lack of visible injuries. Matthias turned to Tracy, his expression serious. "Tracy, did you know Hans is related to Lotta?" he asked. Tracy nodded, her eyes downcast. "I'm sorry for hiding that," she said softly. Matthias's voice was firm but not unkind as he explained the legal consequences of withholding information. He stressed the importance of Tracy's full cooperation now, for both her sake and Hans's. Tracy's eyes widened with worry. "What will happen to him?" she asked. "He'll be processed legally like Victor," Matthias explained. "We'll investigate his brothel too." Tracy's words tumbled out in a rush. "You can't close his place down. He has no one here, so many enemies. Victor and Lotta's men hate him. You have to protect him. Yes, he sold substances, but that's all. His brothel in the red light district is legal. Please, you should arrest Lotta instead, not Hans." Matthias considered her words carefully. "We'll see what the investigation reveals," he said finally, "but we'll keep your words in mind. For now, we need you to come to the station so we can talk more." As the paramedics readied Tracy for transport to the police car, she cast a guilty glance at Catherine, her eyes heavy with unspoken words. Catherine felt a deep swell of love and compassion for her daughter, even as she struggled to fully understand her. Tracy had endured more than she could fathom. This world had shaped her in ways Catherine could barely grasp. Without hesitation, she wrapped an arm around Tracy's shoulders, offering silent reassurance in the only way she could. "I never realized how heavy a weight you've carried," Catherine said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "When I found you, I dreamed of getting my Claire back, of having that girl I lost. But now I see you've grown up and changed. You're Tracy now, and while that means I'll miss Claire forever, I still love you and you are still my daughter. I hope you can be the best version of Tracy you can be." Tracy nodded, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her words laced with guilt and vulnerability. "I know it's not easy, and I've been so afraid you'd hate me for this when you found out. I've tried to tell you sooner, but I couldn't. I'm sorry for what I've become." She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling in her lap. "I promise I'll go through with the treatment, rehab and therapy, anything. I want to be free of this addiction. Hans would want that too." Catherine nodded, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips as she reached out to gently squeeze Tracy's hand. "You know you're an adult now," she said softly, her voice filled with both love and understanding. "You don't have to come back to the US with me if you don't want to. If you want to stay here, you should talk to Officer Matthias about it. Maybe there's a way they can figure something out for you, but whatever you decide, just know that I'll support you." She looked into Tracy's eyes, hoping her daughter could see the sincerity in her words, the unspoken promise of unconditional love no matter what path Tracy chose. Tracy considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But you're right, with Hans's fate unknown, living here alone could be dangerous." Catherine nodded, her heart heavy as she looked at her daughter. "We still have 3 days to think about it," she said, though the weight of the words hung in the air between them. Catherine felt a quiet tension in the space, acutely aware of the conflicting decisions her daughter faced. The thought of returning to the US in 3 days no longer held the promise of liberation it had that morning. She had come to realize that Tracy's heart had always been here, in this complicated, dangerous world she had somehow come to know, a world Catherine could never fully understand. It was a stark realization. Tracy had changed, and perhaps her place was no longer where Catherine had imagined it. As they climbed into the police car, preparing for the drive to the station, Catherine's mind swirled with the weight of the night's events. The past few hours had been a whirlwind of fear, heartbreak, and unexpected revelations. Yet beneath all the pain and confusion, there was something else, a glimmer of hope. Love, she realized, had a way of existing even in the most fractured places. It could be messy, tangled in mistakes and regrets, and sometimes even dangerous, but it was still love, raw and undeniable. Tracy had found a kind of love with Hans, distorted though it was, shaped by years of survival and dependency. Catherine couldn't approve of it, but she couldn't completely dismiss it either. Love in its many forms was never simple, and her own love for Tracy, tested by years of separation, the horrors her daughter had endured, and the difficult truths of this night, remained unshaken. No matter how much had changed, one thing hadn't: Tracy was still her daughter, and Catherine would fight for her no matter what it took. As the car pulled away from the curb, Catherine reached for Tracy's hand. For a moment there was hesitation, but then Tracy's fingers curled around hers, their grip tight, as if holding on to something fragile yet vital. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that had survived even the darkest of nights.